We're going to kick off another set of 3 speakers in a panel. Starting this set of speakers is Marcy Sutton. She's an interesting person. I find her fascinating. I follow a lot of the stuff she's doing. I know flattery always makes people feel good though, right? Yay! So Marcy is an accessibility engineer at Adobe. She's also a core contributor to the Angular framework. She knows a heck of a lot about accessibility, but not only about accessibility, which is a very complex subject, but how to bring that into a space where everyday web developers can make it a part of their reality. So take it away, Marcy.
Hello. I am so excited to be here at Responsive Field Day. I was actually born in Oregon, but I'm from Seattle, so this feels like home to me. Mobile phones. We've come a really long way since 1973. I have a photo on the screen of the vice president of Motorola holding the first cell phone out on the street. It's a giant brick. I mean, it's like inches away from his head. And behind him, people are talking on payphones, which also look very strange now if you happen to see a straggling payphone out on the street. So we've come a really, really long way since the first cell phones came around. I have a Venn diagram of things my phone can do versus things I need my phone to do. Our phones can do a lot of things. They can connect to the internet, play games, take photos, go into airplane mode, butt dial people. The list goes on of the things our phones can do. There's a shorter list of things we really need our phones to do, including text message, make phone calls, and work correctly. But work correctly is relative, right? Depending on who you are, your skills, and your abilities. And so it's important that we consider that people who use mobile phones maybe aren't exactly the same as us. We should consider alternate experiences. I'm here to talk to you about mobile web accessibility for developers. I'm a developer. I'm Marcy Sutton. As Liza said, I'm an accessibility engineer at Adobe, where I work to make software more accessible to people with disabilities, along with everyone else, because accessibility tends to benefit everybody. The way I want to frame this today, because we're here to talk about responsive design, I'm thinking of this talk as the accessibility part, or the mobile accessibility part of responsive design, which often we tend to forget. We tend to not test enough, or we just don't know about it at all. And so by highlighting this topic that is often painful and often forgotten, I really want to make it better. My slides are also available online at GitHub if you're interested in those. It's marcysutton.github.io/mobile-A11y. And A11y, if you're not familiar, is a numeronym for accessibility. The WebAIM Screen Reader Survey is a resource that we have in accessibility where people with disabilities will self-report what screen readers they use, what browsers they use, and this is some of the best data that we have for accessibility and analytics. In the last version, Screen Reader Survey 5, there was a question about, do you use a mobile screen reader more than a desktop screen reader? The majority of people said no, they still use a desktop screen reader more, but there was a number of people who said yes, they do use a mobile screen reader more, and then a larger number who said about the same. So the people using both is a pretty wide audience, and then there is a segment of people who only use a mobile screen reader. And likewise, with mobile, this isn't a new idea. We've been talking about this for years. And the data around this in 2014 was the first time that mobile-only internet-connected users surpassed desktop-only internet-connected users. So it's growing. We heard from Sophie about designing for a global audience. This is really important for mobile because some people can only connect to the internet with their mobile device. And if they have a disability or some kind of impairment, well, voila, here we are talking about mobile web accessibility. Getting back to the WebAIM Screen Reader Survey, in the latest version, Screen Reader Survey 6, there's a question about which platforms people use for accessibility. iOS is clearly winning, Android is growing, Nokia is dropping. we kind of think of the big two platforms in accessibility for mobile, iOS and Android. But iOS is a clear winner. And this is different from the general population of mobile users, where Android is growing and iOS is still strong, but there's different considerations in accessibility. So I use this data to frame my priorities, my objectives with mobile web accessibility. I tend to focus more on iOS and Android. In iOS, there are a ton of accessibility features, which is why it's so popular. There's VoiceOver, the screen reader, which is the same screen reader on your Mac desktop computer. There's dictation and Siri. Voice-activated interfaces would be great. Zooming, inverting colors and limiting the colors to grayscale, and then using a switch control to, say you have a motor control issue and you need to have a simpler way to interact with your mobile device, you could use a switch control. Similarly, in Android, there's a great list of accessibility features there as well, including TalkBack, their screen reader. They have their own version of switch access and Braille support, high contrast mode and magnification. And these are all user settings that someone might use to personalize their experience. It's at the native level, but it might impact how they use the web browser on their mobile device. So today I want to talk to you about mobile web accessibility in the context of barriers, specific things that get in people's way when they're trying to navigate the web on a mobile device. We'll talk about the state of tooling and where we are with mobile web accessibility. And then I'll touch on some UI patterns and things that you could take home to actually make your mobile websites more accessible. Barriers to access. There's a lot of them. In the real, offline physical world, if you had a guide dog and you called up Uber and they refused to pick you up because you had a guide dog, that would be a barrier to access. Similarly, the mobile app that you might use to call up Uber, it's a native app most likely, but if that's not accessible, that might be a barrier. And these similar barriers, it doesn't matter whether you're using a native app or a mobile website, we could do better. We could make things more accessible. Some things, because this is a 20-minute talk, I could spend all day talking about barriers. Instead, I'm going to highlight a few, and then we're going to focus more on solutions. Some things that might hurt your users in a mobile web context. Visual clutter, just too much crammed into a small space. Everything's too small, from the type to the actions, the buttons. Things are just too close together. And this kind of goes back to the design team. I'm framing this as mobile web accessibility for developers. A lot of these are design principles. So we've heard a lot today about working together and not chucking your work over the fence. So if you're a developer and you see a design come through that has ambiguous visual icons that don't make sense to people, work together to communicate, hey, this could be more clear to our users. And I think as a developer, you should feel empowered to contribute to the design conversation. Similarly, you might lock down Zoom, and that could be a problem because then someone can't actually double tap to zoom into a web page to read things at a larger scale. You may have hijacked scrolling because you have a certain user experience that you think will be better. Those could be problems for your users, and you should think really critically before you try and use those techniques. And then lastly, conflicting gestures. If you have an interface that you've implemented a custom swipe, say you swipe once right or left to do something in your interface. If the user has a screen reader running, that has its own single swipe interaction, or it has its own gestures. And so your custom gesture may be conflicting with the screen reader gesture. It's something that you want to be aware of. You could provide a separate button or an affordance to the user so that they don't need the swipe to interact with your application. Another big problem in mobile web accessibility is this idea of spotty AT support. And if you see the acronym AT, it stands for assistive technology. That's a term we use in accessibility a lot. It means a screen reader or a screen magnifier or some kind of assistive device that a user will add on to their browser to make their experience better. In mobile web, support is a little less mature than desktop. And here I'm talking about support for ARIA, support for semantic HTML5 elements. It's just a little less mature in these browsers, and so the support might not be as great as desktop. It's just something that we want to be aware of when we're designing responsive websites. There's also this issue of fragmentation, where we just have so many devices to support, so many screen widths, it becomes quickly hard to manage. And we happen to have the big guy, Brad Frost, here today. His idea of device fatigue comes up a lot in mobile web accessibility specifically, because we're already pretty fatigued. We have so many devices to support, it can become overwhelming. On top of that, all of these customized user settings, assistive technologies, it becomes a little overwhelming. And this is just something that, frankly, we have to deal with. By focusing on simplifying and knowing how our users are interacting with our mobile websites, we can hopefully make this experience better. But I think the key thing to deal with this device fatigue, at least for me, is just to try and simplify and not do too much and pack into these mobile websites. In mobile accessibility, I have a blog called Accessibility Wins, and often I'll go out to my friend network or Twitter circle to say, hey, do you have any favorite mobile accessibility experiences? And I always get native apps back. No one ever tells me, oh, there's this great mobile website that's super accessible. And so native always seems to win in this conversation. There's also the idea of a hybrid mobile app where you use web technologies, wrap it in a native shell, and then you have an app that can go into the App Store. So these are two different ways of creating mobile applications and websites that would just be applications, but ways of creating mobile experiences that are huge in the accessibility space. But we're at Responsive Field Day, and we're web developers. And I want to focus on the mobile web part to make it suck less and to make it better, because I refuse to accept that native is always going to win for accessibility. We can make this space better, so this is my goal for this talk. Frankly, accessibility is easier to get right on native platforms. It's like you're at the bowling alley and they have the bumpers and they're kind of guiding you to get it right. There's frameworks and tools that can help you get this right in a native accessibility space. On the web, for mobile, it's a little more challenging. So I'm setting out to change that. I want to make this better. This penguin just like flapping around going, come at me, bro. That's how I feel about mobile web accessibility. I just refuse to accept that native is always going to win. So let's change it. The state of tooling. The goal of this talk, because I did a lot of experimentation, a lot of research on what tools we have for mobile web accessibility, and it's not that great. But I want to mark where we are right now. And a year from now, hopefully this will be better. So let's look at what we do have. It's important to consider when you're looking at tooling for mobile web accessibility that the actual device is different. The support in the mobile web browser is often different than the desktop browser. So using something like a responsive design emulator in your desktop browser, you could do some accessibility checking to make sure that you're not doing something wrong at a mobile breakpoint. But it's important to actually check it on the device because the platform support might be different. And I have a checklist from PowerMapper that just floated around Twitter the other day about screen reader compatibility for ARIA. And if you're not familiar with ARIA, it's an API to add accessibility support into your HTML. And the item that I'm keying into here is that certain attributes in ARIA may be better supported on desktop than on the mobile device. That was what I hinted at earlier with the spotty AT support. And so this is where I want to get to, is more tools that actually check in the mobile device itself so that we can tell, is this supported here or not? One way that we can do this now, it doesn't go all the way for accessibility, but if you've done any mobile debugging for the website, for a website itself, you're probably familiar that you can plug your iOS device, either an iPad or an iPhone, directly into your computer, and then you can debug in the mobile browser. Safari makes this pretty easy. It's really important. I know Safari, as a web developer, is like the last item on the list. But if we go back to that data from WebAIM, iOS is winning. It's so important that we not just leave this browser behind because of the mobile browser. The mobile browser is kind of saving Safari for me, personally. So I'd like to see, not just in the web inspector where you can inspect the DOM, I want to see accessibility tools in here. On Firefox, which is another popular browser on Android for accessibility, because there's really Chrome and Firefox often is what people will use with TalkBack on an Android device, because the support is just better. And so if you were going to debug Firefox on an Android device, you could use the Web IDE tool in Firefox to actually go and look at what's happening in the DOM at this point in time. Similarly, Chrome for Android, because Chrome is another popular browser, the Chrome developer tools are fantastic. There's the Chrome accessibility developer tools, but the problem is that it has not been ported to mobile. There are very few options for debugging accessibility for mobile web. So yeah, this is great. We can go and check out our mobile browser and actually look at it on the platform, but we're in desperate need of better accessibility testing tools for mobile web, because there really isn't any. Like that, I did a couple months of research, and that's what I found. So I'm taking this as a call to arms to actually go and make these tools. And so this is my goal for the next few months. Safari developer tools for accessibility. This is something that we could create. It doesn't exist right now, but it should. So this is a placeholder, and I have a silly cat GIF that says I don't always use a placeholder, but when I do, it's a cat picture. Because I want to replace this cat placeholder with more information later about an actual accessibility testing tool for Safari, because that's the browser that people are using for accessibility. And when I say accessibility testing, I mean it will actually go and point out, did you forget to label an image? Did you use an ARIA attribute wrong? Something that, in addition to checking, CSS and the DOM, will actually highlight accessibility errors for you. Because those tools make it really easy to get accessibility right. But we need to check it in the context of the mobile web browser. So, sorry to say that the state of tooling right now is sort of sad, but I'm hoping, again, that a year from now, it'll be way better. One tool that you can use right now is this API called Tenon, and it's a service that you can register for, and they give you an API key. It's a service that you can basically hand off your markup to them, and they will run an audit. And their set of tools, or their set of audit rules that they run against your code are fantastic. They will highlight errors that you never would have caught just by poring over your source code. It is a service that you have to pay for. But it's worth it. If you are on the hook for accessibility, this is a really great tool that you should try and get your boss to pay for. They have some parameters that you can frame your request to them. Say you have a responsive site and you have breakpoints for mobile. You want to make sure that you don't have any straggling content that should be hidden, but it really isn't. You could send a viewport width or a viewport height to Tenon along with your request, because you actually have to send your source code to them, they validate it, and then they return a response to you. So you can send some parameters along with this request to say, show me an audit at this breakpoint. You could similarly send a user agent string if you wanted to say this is a certain browser. This is about all we have right now, and this is not actually testing it on the mobile device. This is like the responsive design emulator, where you're just saying, at this breakpoint, show me this design. So this is part of the way there, but we really need something that actually fires it up on the mobile device and checks it in that context. So not that great right now, but hopefully we can make this better. In the meantime, there are things that we can focus on to actually make our mobile web experiences better. So I'm going to highlight some mobile UI patterns that will hopefully be the meat of this talk that you can actually take home with you. The rest is sort of work for me and anyone else who wants to join me. You are competing with the browser's reader button in the mobile web space. If you've used Safari on iOS, you may have seen this reader view available. My blind friends will often say that is the most used button in their mobile web browser. So you're competing against this reader mode where they strip out all of your stuff and they just present content. And if you're a designer or a developer and you've been slaving, I am a perfectionist. I will slave over something to get it pixel perfect. To have somebody just totally chuck it out the window and go and use the reader mode is really sad. So what you want to do is try to simplify so that there are less reasons for somebody to go and hit that reader button. One thing that you could use to help you in this process is the BBC Mobile Accessibility Guidelines. This is a fantastic resource for highlighting design principles Development principles, they sort of break it up by audience. So if you're more of a content person or more of a designer, you can go and get really good information about how to make your mobile web accessibility, or your mobile website more accessible. So I highly recommend the BBC's guidelines. Some actual UI things, and this is in their guidelines, but touch targets. And I hinted at this earlier in the barrier section about things are just too small. I have an example from Creative Block, which is NetMag's site that they post their content on. And ironically, I found an article called The Top 10 Mobile Design Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. Because they're an EU website, they have a cookie warning. Unfortunately, to make matters worse, there are 2 cookie warnings showing up. But I actually have VoiceOver running. When I took the screenshot, I had VoiceOver running, and their little cookie warning is essentially a tray that rolls up at the bottom, and it has a close button. The X in that button, it's surrounded by white, so it looks like the touch target is larger than it is. But when I run VoiceOver on it, it will actually highlight the actionable area. It is just the width of the X. The X is much smaller than your actual finger, and cognitively, we're looking at this thing without that VoiceOver outline, and you think the button is all of the white, but it's not. With CSS, that would be a really easy fix. You just give the button some more padding, give it a little more space, and then it becomes a lot easier for human fingers to hit the button. Someone who does this really well is Simply Accessible. Their responsive site is a shining, glowing example of great accessible design. Their menu button goes all the way across the screen. Like, why not? Why are we cramming everything into this little tiny space? We're trying to put more into a small space. They just go for, like, whole hog for the user. Like, make the button go all the way across the screen because it's so much easier to tap. Why aren't we doing that more? Let's do that. Give it more generous padding. Use buttons, like real buttons, you know, HTML buttons, not divs. The problem, and this, I see this a lot, and I get a rage face every time I see this. CNN is guilty of this, but it's not unique to them. This is really common. People will mark up an action as a div. I don't know why. Maybe there's like a little bit of CSS they don't want to reset. The problem is that a div is not an interactive element. You can't tab to it with the keyboard. If we're in a responsive experience, you sometimes will have a keyboard. If you use a real button element, it becomes a semantic element that a screen reader can use to actually close this warning. Because right now, you just have to like magically move your finger over the screen, and it won't actually do anything because there's no label. It's just a visual X. There's no way for someone using assistive technology to know where this close button is, or that it even exists. It's essentially just not even there. So if you use a real button and you add a label, either off screen or with the ARIA label attribute, you can make a simple close button much easier to use. And similarly, just using semantic HTML in general will go a long way. And there's a bit of a flare-up this week about whether using semantic HTML is worth it. It is completely worth it. And if you've worked in accessibility, as Liza mentioned, I've worked on the Angular team. I came in all naively like, oh, let's just fix it with ARIA, fix divs. It's really, really challenging. And there's a reason why accessibility people tell you, use buttons, because it's a pain otherwise. So just use semantic HTML and everyone wins. I found an example. I wanted to talk about really hiding content, because on a mobile device, and this is sort of our last big idea today that I'm going to tell you about, is that in a mobile space, when things are off screen visually, you have to really hide them. Because a screen reader can navigate through that content and it's off screen, so they don't really understand why. So the goal is to create a one-to-one experience for a screen reader user as much as possible, as much as reasonably possible, so that they're not navigating content that a sighted user isn't seeing. My example is from Huge, and they have it's a scroll jacking example, which I'm not a huge fan of, but they wrote a really nice blog post explaining why they made those decisions. And this works reasonably well. The problem I found is that the screens that are visually hidden are still accessible. Like, you can still get to them, but they don't mean anything anymore because that part of the experience is off screen. So how do we fix that? And furthermore, what does this actually look like for a screen reader? So I have another example, because again, it's not unique to Huge. This is something that comes up a lot. On Angular Material, which is a project I worked on for a while, I have a dialog example. And when a dialog opens, and this isn't really a great mobile pattern, but it's a responsive framework, so you can open a dialog on a mobile device. What happens when the dialog opens and I haven't actually disabled anything behind it or prevented the user from going behind the dialog? All of a sudden, they're interacting behind a dialog, and that's not what you're supposed to do. So let's see what that looks like in VoiceOver.
Basic usage. Heading, view source. Button. Edit on code pen. Open a dialog over the app's content. Basic usage. View source. Alert. Button. Alert. Alert. Button. Alert. This is an alert title. Heading, you can specify some description text in here. Got IT. Button.
So I'm at the end of the tab order. Now I'm going backwards. So did you see, so the interaction I'm doing on the mobile device, I have VoiceOver running, and I just do a single finger swipe through the page. Before I worked on this dialog, I didn't even know that interaction existed. I'd been working in accessibility for a while. All of a sudden, I found the secret to mobile web accessibility was that there's this single finger swipe that you can go through every interactive element in a page. This is how you uncover a lot of problems on the mobile web. And so in this example, I'm just swiping through the page. I get down to the button to launch a dialog. Focus is sent into the dialog, which is correct. You want to be alerted to the new content. But then when I start swiping behind it, I can get to all of the buttons behind the dialog. Even though I thought I had trapped focus properly with JavaScript, I hadn't really disabled everything behind it. So this is a dialog example, but it's the similar problem that Huge had, where their pages that are off screen are no longer, they're not really hidden from a screen reader. So how do we fix that? Well, the simplest way is for your off-screen content, if you don't want a screen reader to get to it, with CSS, you use DisplayNone. DisplayNone is not an animatable property, so you might need to do it after a timeout. You might need to wait a second until your animation is done, and then you fully hide it. And then right before you animate it back in, you can unhide it. This is just like the easiest way to hide something from a screen reader, so you have that one-to-one experience. That might not always work. That animation delay or waiting to fully hide something might not work. So there is another technique that you can use. Any interactive element, like a link or a button or a form control, something that is natively focusable with the keyboard, if you add a tab index of -1, that will pull it out of the tab order. It's still scriptable. You could still send focus to it with JavaScript, but you can essentially pull it out of the tab order. Paired with the ARIA attribute of ARIA hidden, which you can put on a parent, you can say any region that you want to be hidden, you could put ARIA hidden on it. That will keep things out of the screen reader. But you have to remember that if you use ARIA hidden on something, all that does is it tells the screen reader, or actually it doesn't tell the screen reader that something exists. If you still have a link in that region and you don't do this tab index trick, it will create what's called a mystery control, where you can tab onto it, but it doesn't have any accessibility information anymore. So these two attributes paired together are ways that you could enable and disable content without having to wait to animate DisplayNone. So these are two tricks that are really important for us to know when we're crafting these beautiful interactive experiences that are supposed to work accessibly on mobile devices. So let's revisit our Angular Material dialog and see what it looks like when the content is actually hidden. So I'm at the end of the tab order. I go backwards. Yay! All right. So what I did that was missing before, so I'd written some JavaScript before that the keyboard was fine. I could trap focus in this dialog. But on the mobile device, the content behind it wasn't really hidden. So all I did was I added ARIA hidden to all the content that is behind the dialog. And then you can use that tab index trick to actually remove things from the tab order. Oop. So let's recap. We need testing tools. This is kind of a sorry state of affairs right now, but by highlighting it, by calling attention to it, hopefully we can make it better. I'm hoping in the next couple of months that we can start to put more focus on this and actually get people working on mobile web accessibility tools. We need to optimize for humans and fat fingers and give people a little more space and more affordances to actually be able to use things, because often we're taking a desktop design and squishing it into a mobile device and everything like just barely fits. Like we need to give ourselves more room. It'll help everybody, trust me. We need to use semantics. There are reasons for this. As much as academically we want to get rid of all this stuff, they really serve a purpose, and it's because semantic HTML has been developed over time, and it is well supported by accessibility tools. So we can't just chuck it out the window. Even though ARIA is great and JavaScript is great, semantics are really important for accessibility because it means that we're adding, non-visual information to our mobile websites, and this is super important whether you're in the desktop or the mobile space. We need to craft our source and tab order so that we know when content is actually hidden and is visible. And so we can use some HTML and CSS to actually really hide things when they're off screen. And simplify, because you're competing with that browser's reader button. So the more that you can do to just simplify, give users more space, make things easier to use. It seems like a similar paradigm to performance, where we're saying simplify, cut any external requests that you can to make things more performant. This is true for accessibility as well. So don't give up on mobile web accessibility, because I haven't. I'm actually more energized when people say, native is just better. I'm like, no, we're going to make this better. I refuse to accept that, so don't give up on it. I'd love your help. Thanks for listening.